Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week.
My sense is that there's a real balance in the human psyche of, yes, dreading the uncertain and trying to reach out for help, but at the same time, hunkering down and finding strength within.
If you can change by doing your job, you're literally saving lives. There can be no more important role than the one that you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, I think it was really tough because everything that the callers were going through, we were going through a lot of it as well. The uncertainty, other services closing that they would usually get support from, but we would usually signpost to as well. So we were having to make adjustments as the world was.
And I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday.
Mental Health Monday with Mick Coyle.
Tackling the stigma.
So hello, welcome to this week's edition of Mental Health Monday. Once again, really busy show, and I've got two guests this week. World Suicide Prevention Day was this Thursday's just gone, and of course many people having conversations around mental health as a result of that, and of course talking about that key issue of suicide. Specifically, I've dedicated the last 2 weeks to discussions around suicide because it is such an important topic. You can still check out last week's edition with Jake Mills from the Hub of Hope and Chasing the Stigma, episode 171. But on to episode 172 now with the team from Papyrus. Now, Papyrus are an organisation based out of the northwest of England, but they operate right across the UK and do wonderful, wonderful work raising the issue around child and young persons' suicide and going above and beyond when it comes to tackling the issues around it. That providing as well Hopeline UK, a service that you can call. Details of that on the way too. And those new figures that came out from the ONS this week looked at the numbers of deaths of young people and any deaths, and we've said this before, around suicide are too many deaths. Those deaths around young people under the age of 25, around about 600 lost in 2019. Just a frighteningly high number of people, of course it is. But at the same time, we've got to think of, well, what are those services that are available? Where can the people who are at risk for next year's figures go to now? Where can they turn to at this particular moment? And one of those services, and there are many services out there, could be Hopeline UK. It might be the first thing that you call. It might be part of a series of things that you do to call. It might not be you. It might be a loved one who signposts Hopeline UK, a helpline number that you can call to discuss the issue of suicide around a young person that you care about, or indeed, if you are a young person thinking about suicide, to talk to somebody about how you're feeling. Details on the way of the phone number and how you can get in contact. Plus, we'll speak to one of their call handlers. First up, though, we're going to hear from the Chief Exec of Papyrus, Jed Flynn. And Jed's dealing with 1,001 different issues at the moment, as you can probably imagine. One of the things that he really wanted to touch on, though, was the fact that many of the calls coming through to Hopeline UK focusing on the issue of COVID-19. But also, we've got to bear in mind that moving forward, in a post-lockdown world where potentially the issue of coronavirus moves away, there will be some mental health issues which remain.
Yes, indeed. At the beginning of lockdown, I think we all just went to ground and hoped for the best. And then as an organisation, we realised that people were being quite resourceful at the beginning and really hunkering down and finding new strengths that they possibly didn't know they had. And that included our teams as well. And then I think the call rate, we expected it to rise significantly, and it didn't at first. But what did happen was people were all mentioning that issues around anxiety and fear around the unknown, around this COVID-19 epidemic that was new then, and also the reality of being locked in and having to stay at home against their will often. So it was a very interesting few months, really, and then numbers did significantly rise, and our teams really rose to the challenge and met that demand.
Can I ask you about that and the reasons why you think those sort of circumstances played out? This idea that, first and foremost, people, I think, were just trying to get their head around what the new normal was supposed to be. But then over a period of time, you say things started to change. What were those themes that were starting to emerge during that time as those calls started to pick up?
I guess ordinarily we would expect on any helpline like ours, any significant change will cause distress for some people, and young people particularly sometimes. So things like relationship breakdown, loss of friends, any change of circumstances. Normally, we get everything from abuse, domestic violence, as I say, relationship breakdown, debt, financial issues, unemployment, everything. But the common thread often for our helpline, of course, is suicide ideation and people considering ending their lives. And I always say that suicide is complex. It's not the result of one causal factor. It's often much more multivariate than that. But I think in these days, added into that mix is that unusual being locked in, and the fear of what the future will look like. Remember, for most of us in these islands, we've had to wait for guidance that was often coming at sort of 3 hours' notice. We were asked to do something new, or we were allowed a little bit of social time, whatever. And that's none of us has ever navigated that sort of world before. So even for our teams, there was a steep learning curve to enable each other to navigate, as I say, those very unusual circumstances.
Can I ask you about that? Because, of course, your teams will draw on, years and years of experience, both in terms of their training, but also their lived experience. When you're dealing with issues of bullying and depression, maybe, when you're looking at issues of exam stress, another example there, you can almost draw on things you remember. But actually, even for your own teams, they'd never experienced a global pandemic. And, often when you talk about exams, you can almost picture and cast your mind back, can't you, to those conversations you had before, during and after, and you can see it within a context. And one of the things that's really struck me about this pandemic, Jed, is that we've not been able to see it within a wider context because, as you say, things have been coming thick and fast. And I guess your team were in that situation there where young people were looking for reassurance and your team able to give it, but not in the same way, I imagine, as they normally would.
That's true, but to some extent. I would suggest that the richest part of any therapeutic conversation is when the helper is able to disclose how they are a little bit without dominating that conversation. So if I'm helping you, Mick, I'm not going to tell you all about my woes. That's not going to do you any good. But a little bit of self-disclosure. And for an advisor simply to say, look, this is difficult for all of us just now. And it kind of normalizes it and validates that other person's experience. So it's not that we have an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's trouble. Sometimes our best endeavours are when we're able to engage as human beings and say, look, this is how I'm experiencing this. And maybe sharing some self-care tips with the caller or the texter or the emailer, just to say what you're going through now might be really painful, really distressing, unprecedented, that very overused word. But actually, there's something normal about it just now. Hang it in there. Stay with it. You'll be okay.
Can I ask you, as we sort of move into this sort of new period now, where we're kind of post-lockdown, but there seems to be a real hangover in regard to some of the issues that people have faced, and still very much uncertainty around countless things. Although the physical threat of coronavirus is decreasing, or has decreased from those peak months, what are you seeing in terms of those mental health pressures and those calls in regard to issues around suicide? Is that easing as lockdown eases?
Well, I guess my perspective is a little wider than the Hopeline. So my colleagues on Hopeline would have a view coming from the calls they're taking. My view is a little wider. I listen fairly regularly to a number of charities across the country. We get together and we talk about how are they, getting through these unusual times. And there's a bit of a debate whether post-lockdown will have a sort of a massive tidal wave of demand on our services, and we're gearing up for that. And yet there's also a tension there, because if we kind of push that out into the media, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. My sense is that there's a real balance in the human psyche of, yes, dreading the uncertain and trying to reach out for help, but at the same time hunkering down and finding strength within. And I think we will probably find that balance continues as time goes ahead. So what I'm saying is that people are not always my common narrative often when I come on a radio show like yours is encouraging people to seek help and for caregivers to offer it. But at the moment, I'm also recognising that we have learned something new about ourselves in these difficult times. We've all had to reach in and find strength. So I suspect going forward, there will be new uncertainties that come, I suspect, at access points like when the job retention scheme ends next month. But I think fear of losing one's job is a real contributory factor for many in terms of thinking about suicide or becoming emotionally distressed. So I think we can predict some points along the timeline where we will have increased demand on our and similar services. But I also think we've got to recognise that balanced view, that people have learned new strengths, new skills, and found ways to support each other. So in my long-term dream, you won't need a helpline like Hopeline UK, because we'll all have the skills and the resources to share to keep people safe from suicide.
But isn't that why organisations like your own and those great organisations that you work with are so actually crucial? Because we'll all have big takeaways psychologically, I think, from COVID-19 and coronavirus, and we'll all have our ideas about how it's changed us and how it's going to move us forward. But do we need that framing almost within a context psychologically, so we almost get an understanding of how we feel and why we feel that way? Because for many people, there's been periods of huge isolation, of grief in many cases, of course, but also the anxiety, the stress, the fear of the unknown as well. So do we need a bit more sort of emotional guidance to get our heads around what we've experienced?
Yes, possibly. I think perhaps because I'm in the business of suicide prevention, sometimes I take it for granted almost that support services exist and so on. And as I said, one of my sort of more common themes in my conversation with media like yourselves is to say that we need to reach out and get help. But that's not easy, especially if you've never really needed to do it before. And for many, many, many people, as we know from the stats that are presented every day by Public Health, this sort of worldwide change is new to most of us, so that's inevitably going to impact the level of confidence people have to reach out and get support from an organisation like ours.
Can I ask you what your advice would be to families who are maybe spotting signs of change within their sons and daughters, and as things have gone back to school, as a sense, well, maybe they'll jump out of it because they're back to quote normal? What would you say to families in regard to that advice that doesn't sort of raise the issue of suicide potentially, but it may be countless different mental health issues, but done in a way which is helpful to that child?
Papyrus often finds itself in that difficult position of raising a subject that nobody wants to look at or talk about. And many of the people who come alongside Papyrus do so after having lost a child to suicide. And that's such a tragedy. And there's a tragedy within it too, that we didn't get there before the death. And so all our endeavours are about saying, we think this is going to happen to somebody else and we don't want to happen to anybody. So why not learn about it now and find ways to support your young person in terms of their mental health and well-being before it's too late? That sounds a terrible message. It sounds like I'm being a doomsayer, but I'm not. I'm saying countless times over my years at Papyrus, I've heard a parent say, I never thought it would happen to me. Only the day before we were so happy and everything was well. So that's why I think it's a very difficult message. But to your listeners, I would say, please take some time in the next 24 hours to look up Papyrus, Papyrus, on any search engine. There's some very pragmatic, straightforward, plain English sort of lessons there that we can all apply right now. So in terms of how do I know when a child or young person is distressed, you know your own child better than anybody, I guess, and the relationship you have with them will be unique to you. But building on that strength, building on that connectedness is my first piece of advice. Actually keeping communication open with your young people, talking to them about how life is, particularly at the moment for them, whether they're in work or not, whether they're in school or not, finding ways to keep the conversation going. The principal protective factor for young people remains connectedness. So if we can keep connected with them, even if they're in the room all the time with the headphones on the Game Boy or whatever the latest craze is, try and find ways to go in with a cup of tea and just say, is everything okay? How are you doing? What are you doing at the moment? Not being nosy, but keeping that line of communication. Keep them interested in how you are with this COVID thing too. That the more we can normalise that this is a difficult time, the more they're likely to reach out and get help from you and from an organisation like Papyrus.
I think sometimes people use the phrase threshold fear, don't they? The idea of sort of stepping over the boundary of a normally a physical place. But actually, I think there might even be people listening to this who might think, oh, even the idea of clicking on a website and reading about an issue which might be based around, the suicide of a young person feels too like a step too far, or it feels like something that's too morbid or too depressing, not something they want to even consider. What do you say to people who maybe feel like that, who don't know, or maybe don't have a situation at the moment where they need the services, but they may well do in the future? And we've got to engage with those people, haven't we? Because if we engage with them now, we may not hopefully need to engage with them in the future.
I agree. I think firstly I'd want to acknowledge how real that is for most of us. I often tell the tale of, I go around the country talking about suicide prevention, and I want people to talk to their children and so on, and then one of my own family comes on my radar, and I find it very difficult. And that's the reality for most of us. We all hope that somebody else will deal with these problems when they're close to home. After validating that, though, I want to say, frankly, but sensitively, we need to get over ourselves a little bit. We need to, just because I know about diabetes doesn't mean I'm going to get it. Just because I have contributed to a cancer charity doesn't mean I'm going to get it. And similarly, just because you know about emotional distress, mental illness and suicide doesn't mean it's going to happen. I think the most prevalent myth is that if we touch the word suicide, it will happen to us. And forearmed is forewarned. And prevention is our business at Papyrus. We're not here to cause this awful tragedy. We're trying to prevent it, and it is preventable. Most of the deaths that appeared in the recently published statistics of suicide by the ONS were very much preventable premature deaths, and that's a national tragedy. And why wouldn't we want to get over that threshold and help to contribute to bringing those numbers down? Every human life lost to suicide diminishes us all. And we can help to change that curve significantly just by engaging in the subject, talking about it, and as you say, maybe overcoming our own personal fear to look at this on a simple website, just to say, at least I know when and if that ever comes across my threshold, I've got a resource available to me before it gets too late.
Jed Flynn is with us, Chief Exec of Papyrus. Just a quick heads up, the Papyrus website, if you just Google it, it's the first thing I think that comes up, papyrus-uk.org. I'll also give you the Hopeline number as well, 0800 068 4141. That's 0800 068 4141. Jed, obviously the point of contact that many young people have now as we head back into September and school life, disrupted though it is those school teachers and hopefully those support staff who I'm hoping are back in school, as are the pupils. Are you having conversations with sort of education departments and local authorities to ensure the school support is there? Because obviously you can't reach every young person, but schools are well placed to spot signs in young people if they have sort of shown changes in behaviour in the period of time they've been away.
Yes, so Papyrus sits on the National Suicide Prevention Strategy Advisory Group. So right at the top table, really, in terms of suicide prevention in this country and in Wales. We have a similar body in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. So we influence those bodies, and then regionally we do the same. So every local authority or its equivalent in the devolved nations has a sort of suicide prevention lead, usually a partnership and a plan. And so we engage with those partnerships to make sure that young people are not forgotten about. And in terms of schools, we've developed the Building Suicide Safer Schools and Colleges guide, which helps governors, teachers, parents and young people themselves to engage in this difficult subject and to build a community which doesn't shy away from the word suicide, that has resources ready, including leaflets and posters and all sorts of merchandise and papyrus to normalise this experience for the young person. Not to normalise suicide behaviours, not to normalise death, but to normalise the ability for each of us to reach out and seek help, and to normalise for adults in the school to be able safely to open up a conversation with a young person and to keep them safe from suicide.
And that's important, isn't it? You know, going back into school, a lot of pupils have spent many, many, many months away from a classroom. And of course, you know, if you wanted to base this around sort of league tables, you could say, well, what about what about your maths knowledge? What about your geography knowledge? What do you remember about physics? But actually that conversation, how are you? How have you been? How are you feeling? Might actually be one of the most important conversations that a teacher has with a young person.
I think, to be fair, I've worked in and around schools for a couple of decades or more now, and I've seen the growth in the interest of emotional health and well-being agendas. So over the years, I'm thinking back to the SEAL program about 10, 15 years ago, the social and emotional aspects of learning. So it's not that this isn't happening. There's some wonderful stuff going on. You know, if you go to school now, you're more likely to be able to speak about your feelings than when I went to school eons ago. So I do think we need to recognise the good work that's been going on. I do think, though, that mental health has risen up the agenda for schools and organisations that work with them, but suicide largely remains off the table until, sadly, there's a death in a school, and then there's a panic, and what do we do? And I want to change that round, really, and just say, enable schools, yes, to respond when there's been a tragedy, but much more important, you know, let's get the resources into the school now to prevent that happening.
Absolutely. Jed, it's always a pleasure to sort of catch up with you and to hear about the work of Papyrus and the ongoing work as well. Is there a little bit of a sense of, from yourself personally, a little bit of a sense of the unknown in that, you know, again, we're in these, quotes, unprecedented times, and we don't really know where we're going to be by, say, December, by April of next year, heading into next summer. There's uncertainty, isn't there, for absolutely everybody, and there are only sort of certain things that we can control, and we're doing our best to control them, but there's this wider issue going on that's leaving people feeling all sorts of different things.
Uncertainty is the bread and butter of a person who is having thoughts of suicide. That's the framework we utilise on Hopeline UK, recognising that a person, whatever his or her circumstances, when they're thinking about suicide, and they may take a while, even during a call to a suicide helpline, to have the space where they feel safe to say, yes, I'm thinking about suicide, then our advisors recognise, as I do, that it is the uncertainty that is common to all of those calls. Shall I live or shall I die? That's the sort of existential crisis that people are engaging in. But they wouldn't have those words, so they may focus on the thing that's wrong, you know, the person that they've lost, or the shame that they feel, or the strong feelings they're having, or the lack of sleep, or whatever it is, the presenting symptom, if you like, sometimes will be their focus. But underlying that, we recognise uncertainty. So I think if we start from that point, that uncertainty is something that, in which, however difficult it can be, we can find and create hope for each other, then I think, you know, my uncertainty about the future is as real as yours, Mick. I don't know whether my circumstances will change tomorrow. Who knows, in terms of jobs, in terms of family, in terms of being well and not well. None of us knows at the moment, and that can be a really, really shaky place. But my sense as well, if we're hopeful, optimistic people that we're trying to be, then these are opportunities as well. So the uncertainty, what is this current uncertainty enabling me to think about me and my fellow human beings? How can I find new strengths that I didn't really need before, but now I'll need all the resources I can get? And that's a message for our young people. If you're thinking about suicide, don't struggle with that on your own. We're all in this uncertainty together. Please, please, please reach out and seek help from a safe friend. And if you can't find somebody you can talk to about suicide, talk to Hopeline UK. and we're professional advisors, and we'll give you sensitive care to keep you safe from harm.
Brilliant advice. Jed Flynn, an absolute pleasure as ever to catch up with you. Thank you so much for your time and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mick.
That was Jed Flynn, then, Chief Exec of Papyrus, joining us now. We talked about Hopeline, Hopeline UK, the number 0800 068 4141. We've got one of their suicide prevention advisors joining us now. Delighted to say Natalie's with us on the programme. Natalie, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for speaking to us today. I mentioned to Jed before the idea that sometimes you guys will draw on either your own expertise or your own worldview based on some of the difficult things that young people are going through. We've all been young once, but we've not all been through a global pandemic before. Jed mentioned, the high volumes of calls that were mentioning coronavirus. Was that difficult for people like yourself when there was actually so much uncertainty right across the board as to how to best respond and give reassuring answers at a time where it felt like nobody in the country knew those answers?
Yeah, I think it was really tough because everything that the callers were going through, we were going through a lot of it as well. The uncertainty, other services closing that they would usually get support from, but we would usually signpost to as well. So we were having to make adjustments as the world was at the same time as people accessing our help. So it was a challenge.
Were you there? Could you be honest with them about that, do you think, when they were looking? Because I guess sometimes people were looking for answers that maybe weren't necessarily there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were hoping that we could give them something that we were hoping we would get as well, a sense of where this is going, how we resolve it, what we do now. But I think a lot of what we did was validating their fears. Yes, it is really scary. We're all sharing in that uncertainty. And right now we need to find how we can cope the best we can and look at what resources are available, because we don't know what's going to happen and it is frightening for all of us. So I think being able to share those feelings that we were having too didn't necessarily help the situation, but it maybe helped people feel less alone in the worries that they were having.
What were those things that you were able to draw on from your own expertise and experience that you could bring into the conversation when you obviously couldn't give answers about coronavirus and a global pandemic, but presumably you could frame it around things you were more comfortable with?
I guess there was a sense for everybody about, isolation, not seeing the people or the support services or even the points of support in your social life that you would usually have. All of us could relate to that at the same time. So being able to have that experience and share it with callers or share that understanding with callers was something that helped us support them, but maybe helped them to feel understood as well.
In terms of the calls that you received, and obviously they're absolutely confidential and quite right too, but in terms of those themes that were coming through, so much of the global pandemic story was about protecting the elderly, a focus on older people. What were those things that were coming through, those issues that were being raised through those conversations that gave you a real insight into what young people were going through and how they were experiencing the lockdown environments?
I guess regardless of the age group, because we speak to anyone under the age of 35, so we could speak to, young adults, but we also speak to quite, young children and teenagers as well. And everybody sort of experienced isolation and loneliness to an extent, but in different ways, schools being off, or people having to work remotely, or a lot of people losing their jobs as well. A massive sense of loss. Even though the situations were different, everyone had lost something, whether it was a job security, social security, or even just a sense of control over their futures. So it was lots of different things, but all with a similar sort of undertone of losing a little bit of control over their lives, which is really scary for a lot of people.
And I know that suicide or suicidal thoughts can come about through a whole range of different reasons. Was it that those people who were calling you were finding that the environment they were in sort of pre-lockdown sort of compounded what they were suffering, or did you find that COVID was a number one reason and the fears around COVID, or was it about a much more complex environment of where a young person was coming from?
I guess it depends case by case based on someone's situation. We certainly got a lot of calls from people who might have had pre-existing issues going on in their lives. They might have been feeling suicidal anyway, and then for whatever reason, COVID has impacted their life by taking away a support, or there might have been the thing getting them through the day was going to work and they weren't able to do that anymore. I guess even for people that weren't experiencing thoughts about suicide before, having issues like that, having a job might give someone a sense of purpose, and then that's taken away. And we certainly spoke to a lot of people that were like, what now? What next? Who am I when I don't have these aspects of my life that were a constant now taken away? So then lots of different ways, but affecting people that were struggling before and were taken by surprise by all of this as well.
Those first phone calls that people make to Hopeline, presumably they're a little bit uncertain as to what you're going to say to them, how they're going to respond, and what's going to happen next. Could you give us a sense, Natalie, about what that process is like, so that if people do call Hopeline or are thinking of calling 0800 068 4141, what it'll feel like, what it'll sound like?
I think a lot of people are scared about picking up the phone to a helpline service, especially when you're going to talk about your personal feelings, thoughts about suicide. It can be really, really frightening, and it's an incredibly brave thing to do, to pick up the phone and call. The first thing that we would do when we answer the phone is we'll tell the caller a little bit about the service, what we aim to do, how we aim to help, and how that works. A little bit about our confidentiality policy, and we do have an intervention policy as well for people that are at immediate risk of suicide and can't reach out for help. So we explain all that. And then the first question we'll ask is, are you calling today because you're having thoughts about suicide? So we'll ask that question so that they don't have to tell us themselves, which can make the call even harder. So we'll take that worry away from them, and then we'll just explore the story. What's led you to call us today? How has it got to this point for you? And take it from there. Every call's different, but we'll explore that person's experiences as much as we can.
And you called the Hopeline. At the end of those conversations, those early conversations you'll have with an individual, do they walk away? Do they hang up the phone with a sense of hope? Are you able in the main to provide that?
I hope so. What we tend to do we take calls from concerned others as well. So anyone that might be worried about someone experiencing thoughts of suicide, and we give advice and guidance on how to help. But the main thing that we do if someone who is experiencing thoughts of suicide gives us a call is we'll work through what's called a safety plan. So we'll help that person get to a place of safety if they need to. We'll identify things in their lives that might be contributing towards the thoughts about suicide and how to change those. And we'll figure out what's the turning point for that person, what's the thing that's keeping them here that maybe they're hopeful for in the future. If that could happen, I might not feel this way. We try and identify those with them. So we don't give people reason to live. We explore what the reasons that they have for themselves are already there, however big or small they might be. And by the end, hopefully, we'll have identified that source of hope and given them a bit of support and a structure for how to get there for themselves.
Do you have a set time limit on how long these conversations can last?
We don't have a set time limit. It can be a really short call. It can be a really long call. It'll be whatever that person needs in the moment. We'll try and give them that support. And we can, speak to that person again if they need ongoing support from us as well. But we are a short-term service, so we'll then signpost to longer-term supports if they need something extra at the end of the call as well.
Absolutely. I mean, as a job to do, you must hear some, truly dreadful things, and people go through the worst time imaginable. But also, if you can change, a pathway by doing your job, you're literally saving lives. There can be no more important role than the one that you're doing at the moment.
You do hear some really difficult things. Often you're speaking to people in the worst moments of their lives, but you're also hearing, sometimes the biggest change in someone's life. You're hearing somebody change their mind about suicide and thinking, oh yeah, I could do this, or I could do that, or oh, I didn't realise that support was there. So being there for those moments is really, really special. And I think that's what makes Hopeline so amazing, that's there for people if they need it.
Is there ever a thing that you remember, something that somebody said to you that made you think, oh, that's why I do this job, that's why I wanted to be part of this team?
Definitely. I mean, we'll always have, some calls are more difficult than others, but there's always those ones where that's really been able to make a change to somebody's life, and by the end you just think, wow, they worked really hard there. And it's inspiring that people in such difficult circumstances can really change that around by being brave enough to pick up a phone. That's amazing.
Obviously, when people hear about suicide of young people, suicide of people of any age, it's often based around sort of statistics and its numbers. You're obviously speaking to the people and the person with the reality and the story, and it always strikes me that whenever you get a stat out about the number of people lost to suicide, I always think next year's stats, next year's numbers are people who are alive, who are here today, but are on a pathway which in a year's time could potentially put them in really serious danger. It must be interesting from a work point of view, hearing those conversations and the journeys and pathways that people have found themselves on, where they've not been able to make the right turn, they've not been able to have the right conversation, that sent them down a pathway where they've decided that suicide is an option to them. I'm not saying you'd be rolling your eyes or just thinking, why didn't somebody do something then? But you must see that journey and that pathway and get a sense that that's an individual story. That's an individual's journey. It's not a statistic. It's not just something from an Excel spreadsheet. This is a real person with a real experience.
And I think that's, we say at Papyrus that many young suicides are preventable if only we as a community had the knowledge, the know-how to spot the signs that might be there that somebody is struggling and offer an intervention, whether that's just asking a question, are you okay? Are you feeling safe today? Are you feeling at risk of suicide? And being able to facilitate that one concern that you might have about someone to a place of safety and getting them that support, which is why we offer training packages and things like that, so that we can upskill people so that you do make more sense of those stories and see where some help could have been interjected, and making sure that does happen where it's needed.
Absolutely. You mentioned the ages of people. People up to the age of 35. People might be surprised to hear that people up to the age of 35 have been involved.
Yeah, so we at Papyrus, we consider anybody under the age of 35 as a young person. I know that's not the typical age category that we'd call a young person, but it's just about the specifics of how the charity first began. It was set up by a group of parents who'd all lost a child to suicide, and their ages were between 8 years old and 35, which is why we get our funding for that category. We offer support for that category. If we take a call from someone who's older than that, we won't turn them away. We'll still offer them support, but we'll just look for alternatives that can offer them longer term help towards the end of the phone call. But yeah, we are unique in that way.
And I guess as well, the issues facing young people, the age of 16 or 18 that people used to, move out. Actually, that's already changed, hasn't it? That people are well into their mid-20s. Sometimes they're in their mid-30s and they're having to move back home for housing reasons or relationship breakdowns or job restrictions as well. And in many cases, the situation, the environment might be similar to somebody who is 18, 19 or 20, even if you are 33 or 34.
Definitely. And that's why we say, anybody could be at risk of suicide at any point in their lives, because these situations, we can't predict them. They just come along, a relationship breakdown, a job loss, redundancy, any sort of, difficult experience or traumatic event. We don't know when they're going to come along, and they can turn our lives upside down, which is why we say, anyone could be at risk, so make that support readily available just in case somebody needs it or someone that does.
If people hear about Papyrus and hear about Hopeline, but they think, well, I'm struggling at the moment, or I'm battling depression or anxiety, maybe, extreme isolation, given everything that's going on, but I'm not feeling suicidal, so I better not call the Hopeline just yet. What would you say to people in those circumstances?
I guess if they're thinking, I'm not feeling suicidal yet, but if there's a but it could get to that point, but I can see that this is getting worse, feeling worse, give Hopeline a call anyway, because we can work on safety planning so that if it ever did get to that stage, hopefully it wouldn't, but we could work on a safety plan to keep that person safe and have a sort of idea of, if it gets this bad, this is what I've agreed to do to get the support I need to keep me feeling okay, and to make sure that things are fine and I'm safe at the moment.
And Jed mentioned this as well, but it's worth repeating the idea that some people will think that if you mention suicide to a young person, they'll go, well, I hadn't thought about it until now. And you'll give them the idea or seed the idea that they'd take their own life as well. And I just wanted to get your take on that that myth, if you like, or the urban legend that surrounds it?
I think that's because we take calls from concerned others, parents, teachers, professionals, friends, whoever. That's the one main worry that they have. If I ask my friend, child, that they're having thoughts about suicide, that's going to put the idea in their head, and that's going to make things worse. You can't put the idea of suicide into someone's head by talking about it. By asking that question in a safe way, we're showing that it's okay to speak about it if you're worrying about it, that you're a person who can support them and is open to speaking about these issues. And we really want to model that to young people, that it's a topic that is safe to speak about. So the more you can speak about it in a way that is safe, the more support that we can offer and make it a topic of conversation that's not as scary to approach.
Yeah, and that's worthwhile mentioning again, the resources available through websites like your own, where schools, colleges and workplaces can read up about that, so that they know that, so it becomes common knowledge before they even need to know about it. So if a situation does arrive, they've already got that sort of training in place.
Yeah, definitely. We've got conversation starters on our website, so how to approach that conversation. We've got a schools guide, how to set up suicide safer policies within schools, colleges, universities, and we've got leaflets on how to support someone that might be at risk, or how to reach out to somebody that you're concerned about as well. So there's loads available on our website.
Brilliant. Natalie, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you joining us, and wish you all the best with the work you're doing with Hopeline. Absolutely fantastic work. That number again, 0800 068 4141. There's also, if you go to the Papyrus website, links via text and email as well.
Yeah,
that's
brilliant.
all the links, isn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, and great to get you on the programme.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.